No one expected anything of him. No, he wasn't touted as the next heavyweight champ of the world. He broke through. True Cinderella story.
Jimmy Braddock was a major star, a hope, a star in the sky, a star in the headlines for the Depression era. The Depression-starved, literally, fan identified with him. He had been on welfare, he had made something of himself, come off welfare, and was a champion.
He stood up to everyone. He lost one fight on a cut. And then when he was given the opportunity, even though he was on the downslide and past any peak he could have achieved as a fighter had he been handled properly, he still had enough in him to win the big fights.
And this was why people identified with him. In a sense, he wasn't a breed apart the way that many heavyweight champions are, almost freaks of nature. Braddock was a very ordinary guy. He was the kind of guy people could relate to. He was a man off the streets. He was a man like them. He was a man who fought the Depression. He was a man who sort of climbed up by his own bootstraps. And therefore, the fight encapsulated everything that he was, and he went out a champion.
Jimmy Braddock was the essence of the true-blooded American who had a lot of courage, who fought obstacles. Sometimes he lost, sometimes he won, but he never gave up.
The Cinderella Man, James J. Braddock.
During the 20s and 30s, three of the most popular sports in America were baseball, horse racing, and boxing. Millions of people listened to boxing on the radio every day. During the Depression, Americans needed heroes, and they found them in their World Series winners, champion racehorses, and boxing champions.
Braddock stepped back out of the way. Braddock's boxing skill carried him clear of that right hand.
Jimmy went in like a fighting tiger, showing all of that Irish courage that he had.
The winner and new heavyweight champion.
For as long as the history of boxing will be told, one man will be recognized as the Cinderella Man. James J. Braddock was considered a routine challenger for the then heavyweight champion Max Baer. But in one of the greatest upsets of all time, Braddock proved what hard work, a stubborn nature, and a little luck of the Irish can achieve.
Braddock was a likable fellow, and he was an everyman. His story was something that appealed to people, and for that reason he was really very popular.
James Braddock was born in the once notorious Hell's Kitchen district of New York City on June 7, 1905. He grew up in an era of Irish-American boxing champions, so his boyhood heroes were boxers. Braddock was still a young child when the family moved across the river from New York City to New Jersey. He fought professionally for the first time when he was only 20, in a 4-round no-decision bout against Al Settle in West Hoboken, New Jersey.
Jim Braddock made his name for himself as a pretty good power-punching middleweight in the New Jersey amateur Golden Gloves back in 1924, 25, 26.
In 1926, Jim Braddock went unbeaten in the small halls of New Jersey and New York City and began to make a name for himself.
One of the things that really distinguished him at that time is even as a middleweight, 162, 163 pounds, he was fighting heavyweights. And in fact, he won the Golden Glove Championship in New Jersey both in 1925 and 1926 at heavyweight, even though he only weighed 160, 162 pounds.
Almost from the beginning, Braddock was handled by one-time door-to-door salesman Joe Gould. Braddock and the surprisingly savvy 5'2" Gould would share a partnership that would last the boxer's entire career.
It was like a marriage at first sight. They hit it off well. Joe Gould, little guy, 5'2", and there's Jimmy Braddock, 6'2", but lean at the time. And he took him under his wing, and they became close. And it was a meeting that was profitable down the road for both of them, for monies and his relationship between two people.
Joe Gould was an interesting character. One of the things that really distinguished him from the run-of-the-mill fight manager was his loyalty. He and Braddock immediately developed an amazing friendship that lasted through the course of both their lives. Joe Gould was absolutely devoted to Jim Braddock and would haunt the offices of Madison Square Garden and any other promoter, touting Jim Braddock as the next coming champion. Even though Jim had only a few fights under his belt, Gould was absolutely out there, speaking to anyone and everyone he could about him, and just simply singing his praises to everyone.
By 1928, Jim Braddock firmly established himself as a world title contender.
He's only 24 years old. He's been in the ring 3 years, and in that short time, he's come up very, very fast. He's had 46 fights, he's lost only 2, and he's won more than half his fights by clean knockouts.
Within 3 years, he established himself as a top-rated contender with victories over Jimmy Slattery and Tuffy Griffiths, which put him in line for a shot against Tommy Loughran, the great light heavyweight champion.
Tommy Loughran was known as one of the supreme ring artists of his generation. Jim knew he would be a difficult opponent. He would have to fight, not box him.
The Tommy Loughran fight is the fight that really defines Jimmy Braddock early on. Jimmy Braddock's a tall guy, a big puncher with his right hand, and he's looking to knock everybody out. And he's had a lot of success so far. But now he gets in a ring with Tommy Loughran. Tommy Loughran was considered by many people to be perhaps the greatest light heavyweight who ever lived.
There was a guy from Philadelphia, Tommy Loughran, going against New Jersey, Jimmy Braddock. Half of New Jersey was at ringside yelling for Braddock to bring the title home for them. Tommy Loughran, he had such a superior jab, his left jab. And once he zeroed in on your head, he very rarely missed. No matter where you moved, his left jab was in your face. He blooded up Braddock's face pretty bad. Though Braddock went forward throughout the entire fight, never gave up an inch, just kept moving forward, trying for the knockout. And after 8 rounds, when Braddock's face was a bloody mess, Joe Gould, his manager, asked him in the corner, "Stop some of those lefts, Jim." And his remark was, "I'm stopping every one of them, not going by me."
At the end of those 15 rounds in Yankee Stadium, Jim Braddock didn't quite have what it took to become the victor. Loughran was awarded the decision.
Well, here's the decision. Tommy Loughran gets the unanimous decision and retires as undefeated light heavyweight champion.
In the dressing room after the Loughran fight, Tommy pointed to his left shoulder, which was completely bruised. And he said to the reporters, "You see this bruise here? That's from Braddock's left hand. He only threw it a few times during the fight. But if that kid ever learns how to jab, he's going to be champion."
After that fight, it takes a lot of heart out of you when you're a pro for 3 years, have a good record, and you get your shot and you lose it.
Here's a guy, a young fighter, had fought for the light heavyweight championship of the world, and then slowly, for no real good reason, starts to lose a bout, break a hand, lose another bout, win a bout, break a hand again, break a collarbone. Things didn't seem to be going right for him.
His hand badly broken from his last fight, Jim visited a doctor who told him that the hand would have to be rebroken before he could set it. Jim couldn't afford the cost of properly breaking his hand, so he broke it on purpose in his next fight and then went back to his doctor to have it set.
Physical limitations placed on him by these injuries, the types of fights he was getting, the purses that he was getting, everything changed.
By 1930, Braddock's career was in decline. His only wins were on points against an old rival, Joe Monte, and a second-round knockout over an extremely reluctant Phil Mercurio. However, it was the defeats that mattered. It seemed Jim Braddock was out of the picture, and the only bright spot that year was his marriage to Miss May T. Fox.
Even though Braddock had lost the Loughran fight, he still had a decent little nest egg. With that money, he got married in January 1930 to his childhood sweetheart, May.
May and Jim tied the knot at St. Joseph of the Palisades Church in New Jersey. Their wedding was the beginning of a lifelong happy marriage, producing 3 offspring.
May Braddock had the fears of any wife of a professional prize fighter. They always want them to quit. She knew that Jimmy was struggling and that there weren't many choices.
His wife really never liked the idea that he was a fighter. Fighters got hurt, she had heard some of them die, like Frankie Campbell.
Well, I saw him fight once. That was only 1 round, and I ran out of the place screaming.
From 1930 to 1933, Jimmy Braddock lost more fights than he won. He was trying to change his style, but he still had a stubbornness about him. He was still a big right-hand puncher, but now he didn't really have a right hand. He broke it almost every time he'd hit someone hard.
He invested heavily in a taxi cab company, and within 6 or 7 months, the taxi cab company failed, and he and his new bride were in dire straits.
The economy seemed to be traveling down the same road as Braddock's career. The Depression had hit hard by 1932. Thousands of banks closed, unemployment was on the rise, and the average annual income dropped to a mere $1,400 a year.
Boxing, like the nation, all nations in fact, was on bad times. Just as the Depression had wiped out many, many, many businesses, boxing, after Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney had retired, really was a Depression area in and of itself.
And by now, Braddock and his wife had 3 children. He was forced to supplement his earnings by taking a job on the waterfront. It seemed Jim Braddock was destined to become one of boxing's might-have-beens.
In order to provide for his family, has got to turn to another form of work besides boxing, which is the only thing he's really ever known. So he gets a job working on the docks out in New Jersey as a longshoreman, a couple of nights here and there as a bartender, shoveling coal, shoveling snow, any simple piece of work that he can do to try and provide for his family.
The papers were filled with stories about Braddock's family. There were pictures of his kids and pictures of his wife, and there were numerous accounts of the great difficulty that he had supporting them all. There's one wonderful story about how after one of his fights, when he finally had a few bucks in his pocket, he didn't even go home directly. He went directly to the grocery store, bought some food and milk for his kids, and went directly home and fed them.
I think the boxing haven't changed much. It's always been a door for the underprivileged. People without a whole lot of education, men without any other way out, they choose boxing to work out, try to get $1 here, get $1 there.
After a no contest against Abe Feldman in September 1933 and several broken hands, Braddock essentially retired from boxing.
Braddock fought Abe Feldman in Mount Vernon, New York. This was the low point of Braddock's career. He didn't have a left hand. Every time he threw his right hand, he'd break it. He fought a guy, an average fighter, in Abe Feldman, a guy he should easily handle. The fight was so bad, the referee actually stopped the fight and threw both fighters out of the ring.
At this point, he really believes that he's retired. But there's one guy that's still pulling from him, Joe Gould, who's still haunting the offices at Madison Square Garden. Can't you use Jim for one more fight?
couldn't get a fight, couldn't get a job outside of a little bit of working on the docks, and didn't have anything to look forward to.
Ironic consequences of Braddock having to go to the docks and work is that because his right hand was in such poor shape after this fight, broken several times, really unusable, he had to use his left hand almost exclusively to do such things as drive a tie hook into a railroad tie and drag that around. So by doing that, in his mind at least, he felt that his left hand was being developed. And by 1934, he was in pretty good shape from working outside and working on the docks, and his left was as strong as his right.
Then, in 1934, the Irishman's luck suddenly changed.
Then brought him back into contention by putting him in a fight on the undercard of the Max Baer Primo Carnera fight against an up-and-coming KO artist named Corn Griffin.
He agreed to come out for $250 to fight a young, upcoming fighter named Corn Griffin, who was a fighter on the rise, a young fighter, and they were looking for him to fight some named fighters. And Braddock, though he was sort of over the hill, he was a worthy opponent. People knew of him. He's a courageous fighter, fought for the light heavyweight championship. And they thought that would be a good for Corn Griffin.
In many ways, the Corn Griffin fight was the toughest fight of Jimmy Braddock's comeback. You have to remember that Jimmy Braddock didn't train a day for that fight. He was offered the fight 2 days before, and he hadn't fought in a year. He took the fight on no notice, had no training, had no chance to even get ready. He just got into the ring and fought, mainly just to get the money that they had offered him to fight, because he desperately needed the money. This, to me, was the most amazing fight. Beating the other guys was, at least he had a chance to train and to get ready. This fight was just, they basically dragged him in off the street and put him in the ring to lose.
Well, Braddock, who had seen the bottom, he'd seen tough times, being on relief, was really hungry for this fight. And though he wasn't to Braddock 4 or 5 years ago, he fought his heart out and shocked everyone by knocking Corn Griffin out in 3 rounds.
And then he runs over to the ropes and he shouts to the reporters, "I did that on hash. Get me a couple of steaks and you'll really see what I can do."
And yes, he knocked out Griffin in 3 rounds on the undercard of the Baer Carnera championship fight. All of a sudden, he was an item again. He was somebody. He was, in the words of a movie, a contender.
Braddock and Gould both believed after the Corn Griffin fight that they would at least have a couple of decent paydays come their way. It wasn't really the case. The $150 or so that Braddock got for the Griffin fight was immediately spent paying bills for milk and electricity. And it came to the point where Braddock was again destitute, no fights on the horizon, and he signed up for public assistance or welfare. This was a major, major crisis turning point in this guy's life, because as a proud father and provider, to take from the government was not something that was normal. It was a new concept under the Roosevelt's New Deal for this sort of welfare to be given out. But Braddock did bite the bullet. He went down, he signed up, and he got the magnificent sum of $6.87 a week.
As a result of the stunning knockout of Corn Griffin, Braddock got a chance to fight John Henry Lewis, the up-and-coming light heavyweight, who had beaten Braddock earlier in his career.
In November 1934, Braddock finally gets another fight. And what does it happen to be? It happens to be against a guy who's a budding superstar, a guy that's already beaten him before, John Henry Lewis out of San Francisco, just one of the best, most feared fighters of the time. They throw Braddock in with him. This is supposed to be John Henry Lewis's coming out party for the New York crowd. And Braddock again pulls off the big upset, drops Lewis in the 5th round, wins the 10-round decision, and the $750 that goes with it.
After a high-profile win over John Henry Lewis, Braddock was matched against Art Lasky, the apparent next in line to meet the heavyweight champion, and the Cinderella Man was born.
People were surprised he beats John Henry Lewis. And a few months go by and they've got a young fighter named Art Lasky. And they're promoting him as the next upcoming champion. He had a good record, didn't beat too many great fighters, but he had some good fights. And he was a big favorite, I think 5-1 to beat Braddock.
By the spring of 1934, Max Baer was the champion, and Madison Square Garden was casting around for who would be the big opponent for the summer fight against Baer. And Art Lasky was apparently the #1 contender. He had beaten a few different people and was the guy that they wanted to showcase, so they put him in with Jim Braddock as a showcase. Another big mistake, because Braddock went 15 rounds, probably fought the best fight of his career against Art Lasky. You know, if you had to really sum up Jimmy Braddock, I think Damon Runyon came up with the best way. That was the Cinderella Man. And what does that comprise? It comprises two parts. It comprises a fairy tale element, and then there's that story of somebody who can take the most adverse conditions and lift themselves out of it and succeed.
Braddock was now remarkably the #1 contender for the world heavyweight title against champion Max Baer.
Max Baer had been known as a tremendous, hellacious right-hand puncher, and he could be a dirty fighter. He threw a lot of backhands. He did a lot of rough tactics that he got away with because he was colorful.
He was a big person at 6'3", 215 pounds. Tremendous puncher.
The sad, tragic fact is he's responsible, through his awesome power, for the demise of two fighters that are attributed to that power. And one is Frankie Campbell, and then the death of Ernie Schaff.
He hit so hard that in 1930, Max Baer, on the way up, fought a young fighter named Frankie Campbell, who, if anybody's a baseball fan, was actually the brother of Adolph Camilli of the Brooklyn Dodger catcher. His real name was Campbell. And Baer beat him so mercifully, this guy died after the fight. 2 years later, in 1932, there was another upcoming young fighter, Ernie Schaff, who matched with Baer. And Baer gave him a terrific beating, knocked him out in 6 rounds. And Ernie Schaff was never the same.
When you take someone like James Braddock and give him an opportunity at the brass ring, and in that lion's den is Max Baer, and he's the lion that you have to go in and take the meat out of his mouth, Jimmy Braddock was facing one formidable mountain.
Max Baer was the most famous heavyweight, probably the most skillful heavyweight champion of all time. If you watch Muhammad Ali, some of his footwork, speed, this originated with Max Baer.
As Braddock trained for the title bout, Baer spent his time partying and was known to have paid little attention to training.
Max Baer's name appeared in the gossip columns just as much as it did on the sports pages. The entire year between his victory over Primo Carnera and his defense against Jimmy Braddock, you could say that his mind wasn't exactly on fighting.
Max Baer was a womanizer, never trained very much, and was heavy on, you know, after hours drinking and carousing around, and he was not in top shape.
Jimmy Braddock told his manager, Joe Gould, I'm going to beat Max Baer because I'm going to fight him exactly how Tommy Loughran fought me.
Jimmy Braddock was influenced in this fight tremendously by his own loss to Tommy Loughran in 1929. 2 years later, he was in Madison Square Garden and watched Tommy Loughran beat Max Baer by beating him the same way that he had beaten Braddock, by jabbing and moving and staying away from Baer's right hand. Braddock always said that if he fought Max Baer, he could beat him. He'd beat him the way Tommy Loughran beat him, jab on him and move.
Even after battling his way back to form, few people thought Braddock had a chance of winning the title.
No one gives Braddock a chance. They figure Braddock has as much chance of beating Max Baer as a snowball has surviving in hell. Baer is superior, younger, superior puncher. Braddock has been maybe beat 3 young fighters.
Braddock's always known as the quiet warrior. He had some history behind it, but not anybody paid any attention. No one paid much attention to him coming up because no one expected that much of Braddock.
Jimmy Braddock was ready, and I think he knew that this was his last hurrah, and he made the most of it.
This was my big shot, and I wasn't going to let nobody down.
When Braddock signed for the fight, there was, even though people liked Braddock and they were very happy that he had won these series of fights going along against Lasky and Lewis and Corn Griffin, they really felt that his fight against Max Baer would be just too much. that he would be killed in the ring, he would be obliterated, there would be a blot on boxing, you know, if this happened. And Braddock didn't take it too well, of course, the idea that he was being considered just fodder for Max Baer. But Max Baer was serious enough to really try and talk Braddock out of the fight and say, you know, don't take the fight, and you know, he was that confident in his own ability.
Hello, everyone. I think I'm in great shape. In fact, I know I am, and I hope that I win tonight. And I want to wish Jimmy all the luck in the world, no matter who wins. I hope we can still be friends. Thanks.
The media jumped on the story of Jim Braddock, the man who'd made a comeback from nothing and now had a chance at the heavyweight championship.
Jimmy Braddock, as an individual, was part of what has now become popularly known as the greatest generation of this country. Those people that lived through the Depression and had the courage to overcome it and fight and defeat the enemy in World War II. He was one of this country's greatest generation.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
The 30s were a terrible time for America, but the world. But it was a depressed time, and the whole Depression was so, I think, so much a burden on everyone's shoulders, mentally as well as financially, with 1 out of every 3 Americans standing in line to be fed, apples being sold on corners. And the belly of hope was now an empty belly of food. And we were looking for anything, any heroes.
Braddock did something after the Lasky fight that really shows the type of person that he was and where he was coming from. He took the bulk of his purse and he went and he repaid the money that he had received through that era's welfare home relief. That story is the thing that became the catalyst for Braddock becoming as popular as he was. Because the people that were suffering in those days and the people that needed the money and who felt shameful to take it saw somehow that, hey, it's not so bad, you can do this, you can accept help from the government, and look, Jim Braddock did it, so, you know, maybe we can too.
And it looks like those lean days we had for the last 2 or 3 years are gone forever.
And that was the hope of every person in the Depression, to get off welfare, as Jimmy Braddock had, and to stand on their own 2 feet.
Jim Braddock wanted this fight. He wanted a better life for his family. So on June the 13th, 1935, at the Long Island Bowl, Jim Braddock fought Max Baer for the title.
The Irish have been waiting for a heavyweight champion again for a long time, and I think I can oblige him with this right hand of mine when I meet Max Baer on the 13th of June.
15 rounds for the heavyweight championship of the world. Introducing the world's heavyweight champion from Livermore, California, Max Baer. His opponent, the man who in the last year made the greatest comeback in ring history, James J. Braddock of Jersey City. If either one of you happen to go down, the other one goes to the farther corner.
The bell rang. Braddock held his own and took many of the first 6 rounds.
One of the more successful tactics Braddock utilized in the Max Baer fight was that instead of what we call stepping with the jab in a clockwise direction, he would move counterclockwise away from Baer's right hand. He would still get hit with it, but it negated the full power of that right hand that had knocked out Max Schmeling.
Baer is playing with him, toying with him, trying to suck him into a punch. And Braddock is in there keeping his hands high, jabbing, stepping through.
There are times when Bear is so frustrated against Jimmy Braddock that he fouls him, he hits him with a backhand, he hits him in the nuts, he just tries every little trick of the trade, you know, to throw Jimmy off his game. And there's one little sequence I remember in the fight where Bear smacks Braddock across the face with an illegal punch, and Jimmy, rather than turn to the referee or do anything too flashy, because Braddock wasn't a flashy guy, simply pulls Bear into a clinch and butts him right in the face.
Braddock's fighting style was pretty aggressive. He was elusive to beat a counterpuncher in Max Bear.
After 6 rounds of lackluster performance from Bear, the crowd began rooting for the sentimental favorite, Braddock.
Fans, after 5 or 6 rounds, start booing because they think that Bear should be doing more. And Bear tried, but he wasn't able to land 2 clean punches on Braddock.
Then suddenly, Bear landed a damaging blow. He let loose a wild right, and Braddock actually walked into the punch. Braddock's knees buckled. It was the one punch that came close to knocking him down. But no matter how hard he tried, Bear couldn't defeat the determined Braddock with body blows.
What was also discouraging to Max Bear, if you watch the footage closely, is that he did land on Braddock to the body, and he did not stop trying to knock Braddock out. But Braddock withstood the punishment, and that is very demoralizing to a puncher. A great puncher usually has to set himself to get his best shot over. And in keeping Bear off balance, it was a very wise tactic and enabled Jimmy Braddock to survive.
Bear pretended to be hurt when a wild right hand from Braddock knocked him off balance. But Bear wasn't that good an actor.
Max Bear got the idea after about 5-6 rounds that Jimmy Braddock was going nowhere.
Bear fought in outbursts, pounding Braddock's midsection. But Braddock held on. Determination and the thought of his family kept him on his feet.
One of the things that develops in the Bear-Braddock fight that is really interesting is that Braddock dominated the fight with his left hand. Everybody expected him to try and use that big right hand that had won him all those knockouts in his early career. They didn't really realize that by now Braddock was a seasoned professional. He had over 80 professional fights to his credit. He knew how to use both hands, and he knew from watching Bear against Tommy Loughran that the way to beat Max Bear was to keep him at a distance, to outbox him, to frustrate him, and Braddock does all these things to perfection.
Braddock withstood the pounding and managed to keep countering Bear's thundering body shots. The crowd was in a frenzy as the final round came to a close. Regardless of whether Braddock had won or lost, he'd won the hearts of all America. He had fought the good fight, and he had survived. Then the announcement came.
The winner and new heavyweight champion!
Braddock won. He took 9 of the 15 rounds to win in a unanimous decision.
After the Max Bear fight, they interviewed both in the ring. Max Bear says on radio to the interviewer, "I'm happy for Jimmy."
Braddock always said, there are 500 ways to beat any given fighter. I had 499 ways to beat Max Bear. So in Braddock's mind, he always had the ability or the know-how to beat Max Bear.
Braddock made one of the greatest comebacks in the history of boxing and furnished a ring upset that has been unparalleled in modern times.
Jimmy Braddock was now the heavyweight champion of the world. Joe Gould had maneuvered him into the shot and now the championship. And now they just put it under their arm and went back to sleep.
But waiting in the wings was a ferocious newcomer, Joe Louis, coined the Brown Bomber. After the fight, he was quoted as saying, "Ain't nobody gonna tell me these are the 2 best fighters in the world."
The time Jimmy Braddock defeated Max Bear for the heavyweight championship of the world A young black man by the name of Joe Louis was making a tremendous name for himself in the heavyweight ranks, going through all the challengers like a hot knife through butter. By the spring of 1936, the logical contender, #1 contender for Jimmy Braddock's title, was this young phenomenon named Joe Louis.
Joe Louis began in Detroit, moved to Chicago, was really a phenomenon in the Midwest. He was a legend in the Midwest and came to New York with enormous anticipation. The entire American boxing public was waiting to see him fight.
And even after he had 3 or 4 fights, they started calling him the next heavyweight champion of the world because had all the skill, had all the punching power, best combination fight in the world. Everyone expected Joe Louis to become heavyweight champion of the world.
But any plans for Braddock to fight Joe Louis were disrupted when a German fighter, Max Schmeling, knocked Louis out in a 12-round bout.
This phenomenon meets defeat at the fists of Max Schmeling. Ergo, the New York State Athletic Commission dictates that Schmeling is the #1 challenger, the former champion Schmeling, for Jimmy Braddock's crown.
Max Schmeling had ascended to the #1 challenger position with his surprising defeat of Joe Louis. But Schmeling was from Germany, and the fear was that if Schmeling were to defeat Braddock for the heavyweight championship, the Nazis would keep the title in Germany, where they would use it as a propaganda tool.
So Braddock has got to start looking for a way to get out of his fight with Schmeling and fight Joe Louis instead. That's the way to go.
There is a war going on for control of Madison Square Garden. Colonel Kirkpatrick is head of it. Jimmy Johnston, the boy bandit, is the matchmaker.
And so does the Madison Square Garden Corporation. They are now threatening federal court action through their president, Colonel J. Reed Kilpatrick.
But Madison Square Garden Corporation is just old-fashioned enough to believe in keeping its agreements. And it will take such steps as may be necessary to see that the others involved do the same.
Jimmy Braddock was supposed to defend his title against Max Schmeling. He was diagnosed with arthritis in his hand, caused by the various breaks over the year. So what happened was that the fight was postponed. The Schmeling-Braddock fight was postponed. And when they went to reschedule it, when they reviewed the contracts, they realized that there was enough wiggle room. Braddock was able to get out of the contract and sign to fight Joe Louis.
Joe Louis's people made Jimmy Braddock's manager and Braddock an offer they couldn't refuse. It's not like The Godfather. Couldn't refuse it. They told Braddock if he fought Joe Louis, and if Joe Louis had won, Braddock would receive 10% of Joe Louis's yearly purses as long as Joe Louis fights.
To give you some sort of idea of the money that was involved, I believe that Braddock won somewhere around $30,000 for his share of the fight when he beat Max Baer. Against Joe Louis, it would be equivalent of several $1,000,000 in today's money. So clearly the fight with Joe Louis would absolutely give him enough money to live the rest of his life without any worry.
The deal was done, and Braddock agreed to defend the title against Louis at Comiskey Park in Chicago in June 1937, 2 years after his win over Baer.
Jimmy Braddock entered the ring to face Joe Louis, a 3-to-1 underdog. Only a few people gave him a chance to win.
Promoter Mike Jacobs was so concerned that Louis might hurt Braddock that he hired an ambulance to be parked outside the arena at fight time.
With Jimmy Braddock, you have somebody that is a destroyer of the hardest punching fighters that were thrown against him. A destroyer whose legend lives on right now. Someone that not will just beat you, but that's going to put you in the hospital and maybe permanently disable you. And you match that against the grit of Braddock, who may be at the point in his career where he has had his last hurrah.
The only thing Braddock had going for him was experience, and the only real hope for his supporters was that Lewis might freeze in his first championship bout.
Braddock had to look for a way to win this fight, even though it was very clear that he was going to have a hard time to beat Joe Lewis. And one of the things that he did was he figured hit the guy on the chin is the easiest way to win a fight. Braddock, in fact, in the first round does land a little right uppercut against Joe Lewis and dumps Lewis to the seat of his pants.
In the first round, it seemed that Braddock's supporters might be proven right.
Joe Lewis, as the films clearly show, came out in the first round and started to probe Braddock like a matador in a bull, and just to see what his reactions were. And in opening up on Braddock a little bit, Joe Lewis made one fatal mistake, and Jimmy Braddock still had enough in him, enough cagey veteran knowledge to pull the string on Joe Lewis.
Braddock, in fact, in the first round does land a little right uppercut against Joe Lewis and dumps Lewis to the seat of his pants. Lewis recovered, lost the first round, obviously, for the first 2 or 3 rounds, but by the 4th round, Joe Lewis took over, absolutely dominated. It got to the point by the 6th round, every time that Lewis hit Braddock, the crowd was just absolutely imploring the referee to stop the fight. And when Braddock came back to his corner, Joe Gould, his manager, said, "That's it, Jim, you've had enough, I'm stopping the fight." And Braddock said, "If you do that, I'll never speak to you again as long as I live. I'm the champion, and if I'm going to lose this title, I'm going to lose it on the deck."
And Lewis just simply overwhelmed him. Finally hit him one right hand in the 8th round and dropped him. For the first time Braddock had ever been down, and he was counted out there.
Braddock was gashed horribly on the mouth and above and below the left eye. He would need 23 stitches in his face. Lewis drove Braddock's tooth right through his mouthpiece and his lip.
When Braddock went down, he lay there, and then his body relaxed. And anyone that has been hit that hard, and I have, can tell you that the pain and the numbness spreads, whether it's in the body or to the head. And it's just incredible, the punishment that Jimmy Braddock took that night. I don't think anyone could have stopped Joe Lewis on the night he went after the heavyweight championship, but Jimmy Braddock tried.
Jimmy Braddock, having the pride of a great champion, didn't want to end his career with a loss. He wanted to go out a winner. He signed for one more fight with the #1 challenger, Tommy Farr, who only 3 months earlier had lost a close decision to Joe Lewis.
In January of 1938, Jim Braddock returned to the ring one more time before announcing his retirement.
So he chose to fight one more fight. But he could have looked for an easy fight. He didn't. He chose to fight Tommy Farr. Tommy Farr was a tough fighter. #2 contender. So Braddock didn't look for anything easy. He trained. He fought Tommy Farr. It was a hard-fought fight. And at the end of 10 rounds, Jimmy Braddock's hand was raised. Again, he was in victory.
After beating Tommy Farr in 10 rounds on points, Jim Braddock announced his retirement. "This is my farewell to active boxing," he said. "A sport which owes me nothing, and to which I owe everything. The many friends I have made, and the means with which I've been able to provide for my family."
The Cinderella Man, James J. Braddock.
After retiring, Braddock took a job selling surplus military supplies, then went on to the Operating Engineers Union. He was a proud and doting grandfather. He died on November the 29th, 1974, aged 69, and is buried next to his wife, May.
If you look at the man and look at who he was and what he did and what he accomplished, it's truly one of the great stories of all time. I mean, he had nothing. He came from nothing and became heavyweight champion of the world in less than a year. It's a really true Cinderella story.
He wasn't known as a great stylist, but he was forever present in that ring.
Jimmy Braddock went out with the old school, old warrior ethic that a champion has to be counted out. And he wasn't going to give up that title to Joe Louis that night without a fight.
And therein lies the story.
Gangbusters has a special narrator for tonight's case. Former heavyweight champion of the world, Jim Braddock.
The inside facts in the case of the Jersey Butcher Bandits.
You know, Mr. Braddock, Gangbusters listeners usually expect to hear our case histories narrated by police officials.
I know it, Don Gardner, and the name is Jim. The two detectives who worked on it are close friends of mine. One of them was my sparring partner. I saw them work for 48 hours without sleep and for weeks without taking a day off. So I called you up. I thought that I, as a citizen, should come and tell other citizens what our police are doing to protect us.
Well, when you got in touch with us, Jim, we thought it would be a splendid idea, so why don't you go right ahead?
All right, Don. Suppose we begin one day last summer. Go along.